people will, yeah, they're still trickling in, but I'll go ahead and start. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sutirtha, one of the committee in the Conservation Science Seminar, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome amidst us Dr. Madhusudan Katti. Dr. Katti is a professor at North Carolina State University in US. He's an associate professor, and he's also he completed his studies in India, and I'm mentioning that because he happens to be one of, as we called in our institute, a super senior. So he was in the first batch of the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. And just to give a time scale, I was in the 16th batch of that same institute. And sharing a small anecdote, I remember during my interview in that place, they asked me about whether I know an alumni there who worked on warblers in a tiger reserve in India. And then I immediately remembered that I'd read Dr. Katti's article on why we should care about warblers in a tiger reserve. And I don't know if that was one of the reasons why I got through, but yeah, I remember I have a connection with Dr. Katti that way. He's an interdisciplinary ecologist, largely studying urban ecology and its impact on birds. He's been studying birds, and more recently, he's been studying a lot on social inequality and decoloniality. And I'm sure a lot of you have come across his paper and talks about it. And he was also recently nominated as the executive editor of the Bulletin of the Ecological Society of America. So I'll hand this over to Dr. Katti. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that. And after the talk, you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. So yeah, please go ahead. And good to have you here.
Thank you, Sutirtha. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for reminding me how old I am. 16 batches, you say. We talk about batches of students in India, and I suddenly realized that I was the first pancake, in a sense. So maybe, that comes with baggage. Anyway, so thanks for the opportunity to speak here. I wish I was there in person, but we do what we can under the circumstances. So what I want to talk about today is give a bit of an overview of urban ecology through the lens of decoloniality and looking at how social inequality shapes urban biodiversity and urban biodiversity research, and how I've come to work at this intersection of these ideas. Let me start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of several indigenous people groups, including the Tutelo and Saponi peoples in what's called North Carolina now. And there's three, Saponi are organized as 3 tribes living in central North Carolina: the Occaneechi band of the Saponi Nation, the Saponi tribe, and the Halua Saponi Indian tribe. And as a whole, the state is home to 8 state or federally recognized tribes and more than 120,000 Native American residents. I should also point out that I am a professor at North Carolina State University, which is a land grant university. And people may know what that means, but this is it essentially, in the context in which I'm thinking about these things now, I'm speaking from an institution that is a living, active monument to colonialism, because the land that was granted to these universities was land stolen from indigenous peoples. So there's an inherent contradiction for me to be speaking about decoloniality while being a part of this institution. I also want to acknowledge various people who have contributed to the ideas that I'm going to talk about today, some of the research, including my co-authors for a key paper that we published last year, Chris Rissos and Jess Auerbach, my grad students, and members of my family, as well as a whole range of people whom I've collaborated with throughout my career since that long ago time in Wildlife Institute of India and Dehradun. As we're talking about conservation science, so let me start with quoting Aldo Leopold from his famous Sand County Almanac. And this is a quote that might be familiar to people in conservation, and it certainly is at the heart of a lot of conservation science as it has developed in North America. So he talked about how one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds, and that much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. So an ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Now, skipping over the gendered language there, it's worth thinking about the context in which he wrote this. And obviously, in conservation, we do want to try and heal the ecological wounds in the world. But I want to also point out that while focusing on the ecological wounds and trying to heal those, we also have overlooked, including Leopold, also overlooked a whole other set of wounds to the communities that inhabited these lands that we have also ignored or erased from history and our understanding of ecosystems. Here's another quote from Chief Luther Standing Bear of the Oglala Sioux, who said, only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us, it was tame. Earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded by the blessings of the great mystery. Not until the hairy man from the east came and with brutal frenzy heaped injustices upon us and the families that we loved, was it wild for us. When the very animals of the forest began to fleeing from his approach, then it was for us the Wild West began. So the contrast between these two goes to the heart of how people have, especially in conservation, the ideas of wilderness have developed, and what it is that we seek to conserve. And one of the chief problems there is this notion that people don't belong in natural spaces. Following the European Enlightenment sort of tradition of the Cartesian divide between people and nature, humans and nature, a lot of our science and scientific thinking and frameworks for conservation have built around this idea that people don't belong in nature, and that to protect or conserve nature and natural processes, we have to remove or minimize human presence. This is not only sort of a limited view of nature and of humanity, it's also historically inaccurate, because as archaeologists are discovering, humans have historically spread to and inhabited most ecosystems on this planet, right? Except Antarctica, perhaps. And even in places like the Amazon, which we think of as pristine wildernesses, archaeologists are discovering now that there's evidence for humans enhancing biodiversity by planting different fruiting trees and things like that. So for a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of ecosystems, we actually have to consider humans as integral parts of these ecosystems rather than as separate and disruptive influences. And one of the examples that comes to my mind always, when you think about this model of wilderness and what it has done, both for conservation and to people, the classic example is Yosemite, right? This iconic national park, symbol of wilderness, which actually was inhabited by the Awaniki people, and who were removed from this Yosemite Valley because of John Muir and others' conception of what this place was supposed to look like. And of course, there have been consequences of removing Native Americans from these lands and disrupting the way they managed the landscape. And we're still paying the price now in terms of all the increases in fire and these periodic devastating fires that California and other parts of the West face. So it's not only leads to bad conservation outcomes, bad social outcomes, it also leads to incomplete understanding of ecosystem function and lessons that have to be learned the hard way before we start thinking about what are the actual processes that shape these ecosystems and how might we manage them. Of course, I don't work in these remote systems anymore. My focus is on perhaps what you might consider the most wounded of ecosystems, cities. I study urban ecology and have been doing so for the past couple of decades. And in that context, if you think about cities, through my own, the period that I've been involved in the last 2 decades, there's developed a fairly rich understanding of cities as dynamic social ecological systems. And of course, from quoting Leopold, you might think of it as a system full of wounds. But it was only in 2020, this paper by Christopher Schell and colleagues, that a lot of ecologists, urban ecologists, were confronted with something that's really at the root of a lot of the social and ecological problems in the way cities function, especially in the US, which is systemic racism. And this came at a time, again, in 2020, the year when this pandemic began, but also the year when there was a massive reckoning with systemic racism in the US, starting with where you folks are as one of the hotspots. So in terms of thinking about how cities function, this is a figure from Schell et al. 2020, which puts systemic biases, structural racism, and classism at the base of these different layers of different variables and factors that shape the urban landscape and set the sort of template or stage for ecosystem processes to play out. And if we include these social variables explicitly, especially the systemic variables explicitly, then we can see the linkages between environmental justice and social justice, and that these are not separate things, that these actually go together. And conservation need not think of people as being harmful or as being outside of the systems that we're trying to protect, but focusing on the well-being of people and of nature can go together, and indeed must go together. So cities are deeply unequal and unjust places, and this inequality has only grown in the last few decades, even as global wealth has grown. This is a map of Fresno, a city in California that I worked in for 12 years. I was a faculty member there. And this is just a map showing the income gradient from the 2010 census data. So there are extreme gradients of this sort in any city that you look at in the US. The extent of poverty might vary. Fresno is one of the poorest cities in the US with the highest unemployment. But generally, you tend to find this kind of gradient in any city worldwide, right? There are extremes of socioeconomic inequalities. And every city has a colonial history, a history of some kind of segregation. In this case, you have racial and systemic sort of segregation. On those lines, you might have ethnic segregation, segregation based on caste and religion in places like India. And one of the things that has emerged from studies of biodiversity in cities is that cities often, that biodiversity might shows correlations with some of these gradients. In particular, a gradient of a positive correlation between neighborhood wealth and species diversity has been documented and has been called the luxury effect, right? So that you tend to get more species of birds, for example, which is what I tend to focus on, in wealthier neighborhoods, which highlights a dimension of social and environmental injustice coupling together, right? You have income inequality, which also means that poor people not only have, all the other issues that they have to deal with, but they also have less access to biodiversity in the places where they live. And that has consequences for them. So that's to set the stage, and let me do another bit of stage setting in terms of where the framework of decoloniality comes in. So this is the paper that I published with my two co-authors from South Africa. Chris Trissels was a former postdoc of mine at the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Maryland. Jess Auerbach is an anthropologist, so two ecologists and an anthropologist originally from global South countries, but trained in the global North. In both their cases, they had training in the UK and in the US. I got my graduate training in the US and have remained here for a few decades now. So I've described this paper as sort of, articulating what was part of my inner monologue throughout my career as I got trained in sort of mainstream Western ecological science, if you will, but having this position of being somewhat of an, trying to keep an outsider perspective to this and looking at ecology as situated in a broader historical and social context. I won't go too much into the paper itself, and I'll touch on the framework that we presented here. But one of the images we have in the paper is this figure that shows the sort of visible fingerprints of colonialism in ornithology in the naming of bird species, right? If you look at where birds are named after European surnames or have European surnames as part of their common or scientific names, you can see that a lot of them are in Latin America, in Africa, and in the global South, and in places that are hotspots of bird diversity as well. This is a reflection of how ornithology has developed through the colonial processes that led to people like Darwin and others sort of exploring these continents, discovering new species or species that they thought were new to science, although they may be known to people locally, may have had local names, and local names that also carried ecological information that were simply supplanted or erased, and species were named after patrons and benefactors or eminent people in Europe, many of whom now it turns out have complicated histories in terms of their own complicity, either indirectly or directly, in colonialism and racism and slavery, things like that. There's a debate ongoing right now in the ornithology community in North America about renaming some species that were named after slaveholders in the US. And why it's a controversy is something that always puzzles me, but it's taking a long time for people to agree to change the names. But one of the things, so that was the point with this paper, but one of the things that happened when we published this paper is that we got a curious sort of backlash on social media, not from ecologists, but from a whole range of other Twitter accounts, especially, of people with significant followings. Some of these people have thousands or tens of thousands of followers who were upset by the map, that the map was, stupid because it showed Africa as prominent and the South Pole at the top of the page rather than the bottom. And this is, so it was kind of funny to think about this, but it also made me think about how these reactions, calling this flipping of the map as Orwellian, or accusing Nature of becoming an activist Tumblr blog peer-reviewed by Teen Vogue. These are very amusing responses. And you can see that these tweets got a fair amount of likes and retweets. But what struck me thinking about this subsequently is that the reaction to the map reflects how colonialism has a strong hold in people's thinking, right? If you Google world maps right now, the top search, if you do an image search, the top search leads to a repository where you can get all kinds of maps. And the first map you see is the Mercator projection, which had its uses when it was made in terms of navigation, but it presents this distorted view of the planet with Greenland appearing bigger than Africa. And I'm sure people know the problems with that particular projection, but that's what people grow up learning even now. And these frameworks become deeply embedded in our consciousness, so that when you have a map that's slightly different, it sort of really throws people off and raises all kinds of hackles. So it is funny and not funny at the same time to see this reaction. So what we did in the paper was not simply critique science, critique ecology from a decolonial perspective, but also present a framework for how we might start addressing some of the issues. And this framework is, we called for 5 shifts in the way we conduct our research and our conservation practice that should help us address some of these injustices that are baked into our disciplines. And I'll go through some of these with examples from urban ecology through the rest of this talk. I should point out that these 5 shifts, decolonize your mind, know your histories, decolonize access, decolonize expertise, and conducting ethical ecology in inclusive teams. These are not steps in a checklist that you can check off and say, okay, my science, my research is decolonized or decolonial or anti-oppressive now. Nor are they meant to be done in any particular order. The figure sort of arranges these 5 shifts in this dynamic circle. You can enter this process at any point, whether you're starting a new project or are rethinking the work that we've been doing for a long time as well. What it requires is for us to actively engage in these shifts to the best of our abilities along in this dynamic process, and hopefully we can start shifting practices in ways that makes our disciplines more ethical and more responsive to the injustices in the world that we inhabit. So thinking of the first, in that list, it's not the first thing, but if you think about how you might start decolonizing your mind, well, obviously we need to look inwards and start finding our own blind spots. And this is something that science, the methodology sort of trains us to do, but it doesn't go deep enough because we don't learn to recognize colonial and oppressive frameworks in our thinking, and that are part of our scientific theories as well. We have to learn to acknowledge other ways of knowing the world and telling stories. Now, of course, scientists tend to put science on a pedestal, and there is a power to the scientific method that lends a greater legitimacy to scientific knowledge, but there are other knowledges that we have to acknowledge and find ways to understand and build bridges between these different knowledge systems, especially if you want to have effective conservation action. It's useful to learn other languages, even keywords in other languages for things like nature, because other cultures don't make this distinction between humans and nature, right? We tend to think of the European Enlightenment as being sort of the basis for a lot of scientific thinking, obviously, but other enlightened cultures don't separate humans from nature. We have to learn to listen, listen deeply and go beyond just the scientific literature, but to listen to the stories that people tell, the art, the poems, various ways that people express how they interact with and experience and live in nature. In the urban context, how does this look? So I just want to give you an example. Think about some urban open space. I'm sure, wherever you are, you can easily imagine something in your neighborhoods if you live in a city that there is an open space. So what is a vacant lot in a city? Well, it kind of depends on who you are and what your perspective is. You might say, oh, it's private property, and this is particular to the socioeconomics and systems that we are part of. It may be property that's earmarked for development of some sort. Again, development has different meanings. It might be a sign of urban collapse in shrinking cities like Detroit. It might be a sign of urban growth, that sprawl is happening and there are still vacant lots left that are being surrounded by new growth. You might see the potential for an urban park. You might see it as, oh, this is a place that we can do some ecological restoration and try to maintain some nature in the city. You might see it as a place to have a vegetable garden, especially if you're living in areas of cities that are food deserts because of inequalities in where grocery stores are and what kind of food markets are available. You might think of it as a community garden. And again, this spans the range of individualist perspectives versus collective perspectives, and a whole range of ways in which people perceive the land and how they interact with it, and what kind of uses you might think about putting this land to. And some of these relationships with urban land and how that intersects with how people feel living in cities was brought home to me last year when, during the pandemic, there was a rise in hostility and violence towards Asian Americans. And again, going back to Fresno, there's a significant population of Asian Americans, farmers and others in the Central Valley of California. And this was an article from the Fresno Bee that talked about how elders from the Asian community felt that they had a sense of community, a sense of connection to nature, and a sense of safety from that by having access to these plots of land where they had community gardens, and how they were losing them under different paradigms of development and under changing city regulations, which was taking away some of these resources of safety for people living in these places. These are not things that we're trained to think of as ecologists even when we do urban ecology. We do conceptualize cities as landscapes of fear, or in behavioral ecology, there's a rich literature on landscapes of fear and how different species might change their behaviors in different contexts, depending on their perception of risk of predation and so forth. And there are plenty of examples of changes in behavior, changes in this landscape of fear during the lockdown period of the pandemic. Some good true stories, some exaggerations, but you may have experienced this as well in where you lived. With the decrease in traffic and human activity, wildlife came out in urban areas. This was not new wildlife that came out. Most likely, this was wildlife that was already around, but people hadn't noticed it, and it was becoming more active during the daylight periods. But at the same time, if you can think about cities and these urban areas as being landscapes of fear for people as well. So if you think about a place like Jerusalem, right? Here's an article from Landscape and Urban Planning, which discusses the landscapes of fear and safety for Palestinians and Jews in Jerusalem. Again, think about the long history, deep history of sort of political conflict in that region and all the risks people face. But these are also ecosystems where nature occurs and other wildlife occurs as well. And back in the US, Mike Davis wrote this book several decades ago, talking about the imagination of disaster in the Los Angeles context, especially with respect to wildfires in the West. From the lockdown itself, this is a paper that one of my former students co-authored based on a long-term study that they were doing on white-crowned sparrows in San Francisco, where they found that during the lockdown period when traffic was reduced and noise was reduced, the birds actually sang softer songs and their song changed as an immediate response. So there's behavioral changes and there's fascinating research that you can do, but you can also think about variation in noise pollution across the city, across these income gradients and gradients of where nature is, and how that might be impacting ecological and evolutionary processes in the city by having these kinds of effects on wildlife. But there's also effects on different people's ability to study wildlife. Here's an article by the Black ornithologist and poet, Drew Lanham. Dr. Lanham is a faculty in Georgia and a well-known ornithologist. And he wrote this article in 2013 listing these 9 rules for Black bird watchers. Carry your binoculars, for example, and carry 3 forms of identification at all times. You'll need photo ID to convince the cops, FBI, Homeland Security, and the flashlight toting security guard that you're not a terrorist or escaped convict. Is this something that other majoritarian bird watchers, white bird watchers ever have to think about? Or is this something that differentiates and is a particular aspect of the fear landscape that influences who is able to even conduct research in urban areas and which parts of the cities we might be able to access and be able to study? I remember hearing Dr. Lanham speak during the pandemic period at an online event. I'll mention that in a second. But one of the things he said that really struck me was that for him as a bird watcher, anywhere in urban or other areas in many parts of the country, there are parts of the country where he simply doesn't go because he thinks the risks are too high. But even when he's out birding, he's like, I have to keep one eye on the bird that I'm seeing through the binoculars, but another eye on my own surroundings to see if somebody feels threatened by me and has might call the police or something like that. And of course, there was an incident in 2020 in Central Park in New York that you may have heard of, where another Black bird watcher was threatened with police, with a threat of police being called because of an altercation with a white woman. And that brought a lot of these conversations about perceptions of safety for naturalists, for people wanting to study nature in cities or even outside cities, depending on what kind of bodies you inhabit. If you're white or Black, if you're perceived as a threat because you have a certain minority appearance. One of the wonderful responses to that was this phenomenon of the Black Birders Week, which was organized by one of my students, Deja Perkins, and a whole bunch of young birders and naturalists. And it became this wonderful celebration of Black birders and Black naturalists sharing stories and experiences of what it is like for them to be out bird watching and experiencing nature as Black people. And this has become an annual event. There was one held in 2021, and I'm sure they're planning another one for this year as well. And this is one of the responses to try and address some of these inequalities and who gets to do ornithology, who gets to participate in these activities, and who is seen as being legitimate in these spaces. So I'm really happy to see this response led by young Black bird watchers and naturalists. We have to know the history and the interactions of our disciplines with power, right? How does your science interact with the histories that people tell? How well do you know the history of your discipline and its relationship to power? We might think about, okay, today is a day before Darwin Day, so you might know the big figures like Darwin and Wallace and some aspects out of the history of evolutionary biology. You might think about Wilson and others, and there's controversies around that as well, which arise if you start looking at not just the people and the science they contributed, but the context in which they're doing their research and the implications of the research and some of the things they did for the larger disciplines. So we have to go past the popular historical narrative, but look at who are the hidden figures in the discipline, whose participation has been erased, what kind of knowledge has been supplanted or erased by dominant powers. You have to interrogate your own gaze and positionality as a participant in the ongoing story of science. We live in this vastly unequal world, and there's all sorts of complex histories that shape resource use, distribution of biodiversity and people. So what role does your science play in genuinely helping people? And more importantly, does your science work to uphold power or to uphold justice? And justice in a broad sense would include environmental justice, justice for nature, and justice for people. Again, in the urban context, one example of knowing your history is if you think about cities and urban parks, the iconic example is Central Park in New York, which was created by destroying a community of Black people, Black and brown people that was being established and was doing well in that space, but they were removed to establish this park. And not many people know this history, even if you've been to Central Park. Some ecologists, like my colleague Harini Nagendra, shown here, have begun making connections and taking interdisciplinary approaches to look at the history of cities that they're studying and how the social and historical context shapes ecology in these places. And it's really important to, do and promote this kind of work. As I mentioned, cities are segregated, and understanding the roots of the segregation and both historical and contemporary drivers of the social geography of cities is important to understanding the biogeography of cities as well, where nature is distributed and where the green space, blue space fits into the grayscape of the city. An example of ecosystem services and environmental dissimilarities and disparities in that from Chicago. Right, so Woodlawn and Hyde Park are not too far apart geographically, but they are very different places. They might even be, look like different ecosystems. If you look at tree cover in these images, right? Same city, different income profile of the neighborhoods, different tree covers. And you may know of the benefits that trees bring in terms of ecosystem services. So think about what people are benefiting and what kind of wildlife might be living in these places when you have such big visible differences in tree cover. There are studies happening right now that are looking at historic segregation and perpetuation of segregation through policies like redlining. If you don't know what redlining is, it was a policy by the Homeowners Loan Corporation of the US that set rules for lending money to people in urban areas. And they had a system of classifying neighborhoods into this A, B, C, and D in terms of perception of quality. And there's a complex there might be some complexity there, but essentially what it boiled down to was Black people didn't get loans in the more desirable neighborhoods, but were shunted off to less desirable neighborhoods, and you ended up with de facto segregation. But what's interesting is that the legacy effects of these continue even now in terms of social vulnerability, life expectancy, income, all kinds of inequalities that reflect the effects of redlining decades after redlining was stopped. You can also see the effects of this in urban ecology. Here's the redlining map of Durham, near where I work, and several studies published in the last couple of years have looked at a number of cities across the US and found significant visible differences in tree cover, visible through satellite imagery, that nicely or perfectly correlate with classification in these redlining categories, with the lower grade D neighborhoods having the lowest amount of tree canopy cover, and therefore also studies that have looked at urban heat island effects and associated health effects being far worse in these D neighborhoods. So again, if you want to study the distribution of nature in the city, you cannot uncouple it from the history of how tree cover, something as basic as tree cover, which is the basis for urban ecology, came to be because of these political processes that cause segregation. This also plays out in the way we study nature in cities. So I'm sure people are familiar with eBird, this popular platform and app that allows you to record birds and share your recording through the database that's become really global. Right? eBird is truly global. Massive amounts of eBird checklists are submitted around the world, especially with these organized events that's happening again this weekend, like the Great Backyard Bird Count. And the database has become so big that in conservation, it's actually playing a strong role in leading to tangible science action. So eBird data have been used for research and monitoring, obviously, for looking at endangered species distributions and status, conservation planning, habitat management, for creation of laws and policies. But it's when you get to site level habitat management using these data that we run into trouble, as my student Deja Perkins, whom you saw a few slides ago, discovered. So we did, I'm going to run through these quickly and you can ask me for details if you want. In the interest of time, I just want to highlight that we did a comparison of eBird checklists and data that we are gathering through a more systematic citizen science bird count in several cities. This is a triangle bird count, and we have data from several triangle cities in 2019 before the pandemic hit. And what I want to highlight is that you can see that there's parts of the city where you have lots of data from eBird, but other parts of the city where you don't have much data at all, right? Some of it is, and there happens to be a correlation with wealth and neighborhood and demographics in this, in that you tend to get more observations from middle and higher income neighborhoods and relatively less coverage of low income neighborhoods. So if you're going to rely on eBird data, and the same thing holds true in Durham, concentration in some parts of the city, other parts you don't have any data. Tucson was even stronger contrast between where eBird is and where the Tucson bird count, which has been ongoing for 20 years, gathers data. Fresno, I ran a Fresno bird count there for 8 years, and again, comparing data. There's not, as I mentioned, Fresno is a much poorer city, one of the poorest in the nation. So there's not a lot of bird watching activity there. And what there is happens in the wealthier neighborhoods in the north. And large parts of the city are not even covered at all. So if you're going to base your urban policy or habitat management plans on eBird data, you have to be aware that eBird is not unbiased, right? There are significant biases. There are massive advantages to eBird in terms of this huge database that's growing, by hundreds of thousands of observations every year. So it's tempting for large data analysis. But when you start looking at a granular level of where the data are coming from and who's participating in this, you realize that the distribution of eBird checklists reflects the so-called Audubon demographic, right? More affluent, white, older people who are motivated and have the time and means to chase rare birds. They tend to be the ones who submit checklists more often. And they don't go everywhere in the city. They might go to places where they feel safe or where they have expectations of seeing more species of birds and so forth. So if you're going to do green infrastructure planning, for example, where you have to be, take into consideration issues of environmental justice, eBird data are not going to help you, and you have to take other approaches like the systematic counts that we're doing that can overcome some of this bias. One of this example I wanted to share because this is a conservation victory in California recently, where this massive wildlife and one of the world's largest wildlife bridges is now going ahead. They managed to raise funding to build this bridge, and this is a massive victory in terms of being able to improve connectivity for mountain lions and other wildlife in Los Angeles. But while you celebrate that, you also have to look at the history of where highways are placed and how they impact human communities. Right? So there's an article from the LA Times a few months ago that talked about how the highway system in LA is a monument to racism and segregation. And here's an older study from 2005 that showed that, it's titled, "If You Build It, They Will Move." So that the freeway system was systematically located in ways that displaced Mexican communities, especially in East Los Angeles, over decades-long deliberate policy and planning. So when we talk about, fragmentation of habitat for wildlife, how often do we think about the fragmentation of human communities and human habitat through the same kinds of developmental processes that impact both? If you look at many cities around the world now, you see these sort of inequalities in access to nature quite starkly. So, I mentioned Israel earlier, and here's an article that talks about how the wall and occupation is a threat to the local environment. These are pictures from Bombay and from Cape Town that show a really stark divide between really poor neighborhoods and wealthier neighborhoods. You can visibly see the ecological differences there, and you can imagine the effects that has on local communities when you start thinking about the benefits that nature brings. The same thing plays out in the context of who gets funding for research. We're all sitting in the US, and if you're doing climate change research, this is a good place to be, because most of the funding, it turns out, and this is an analysis my colleague Chris Source did recently, because he's involved in writing the Africa chapter for the IPCC, and this shows the funding apartheid, if you will, or the funding imbalance in terms of who gets money to do research on climate change in Africa. I really like this paper, and I think I want to highlight this because this came out again very recently. And this was a big sort of synthesis and analysis reviewing 3 decades of climate change mitigation. And it is refreshing to see in sort of annual review of environmental resources, the statement saying that the common thread that emerges across the reviewed literature is the central role of power, manifest in many forms, from a dogmatic political economic hegemony and influential vested interests to narrow techno-economic mindsets and ideologies of control. So ideology, politics, economics are all tied together, and they obviously have strong influences on the environment, as well as our ability to imagine different futures and to be able to manage for sustainability. That's something that we like to talk about. A couple of final points from our 5 shifts. Inclusive teams, inclusion and diversity is something that we all love to talk about in our institutions these days. But what is true inclusion? How is inclusion not assimilation? That's something that we have to be careful about, right? We don't want to bring diverse identities and people from diverse backgrounds into our institutions and train them all to think in the same way. That's not being inclusive. True inclusion is when you empower and create systems where people with different backgrounds and identities and perspectives can bring those perspectives and enrich our understanding of science. So we have to, in other words, not only give them a voice, but allow them enough power, or share power in ways that lets people from different backgrounds set the research agenda. Because you have to remember that you can only get the answer in science, you only get the answers to the questions you ask. If your perspective blinds you from even asking some questions, you're going to be missing some important insights. Data access is an easy one to think about in terms of decolonizing. You have to know who has access to data, who governs access, who controls access, where are data repositories held, where are museum specimens and samples stored, who has access to them. Are you parachuting into communities to collect data and run, or are you actually committed to working with communities long-term? How do you address imbalances in power between global North or global South countries, or between haves and have-nots within national borders? How much is data access part of your long-term plan? One example that comes to my mind from, again, outside of ecology and science is this wonderful book by one of my favorite Indian authors, Amitav Ghosh, where he talks about doing field work when he was getting his doctorate in anthropology from Oxford in Egypt, where he was trying to reconstruct some of the historical connections between Egypt and India using, fragments of correspondence and scrolls that were deposited at synagogues in what is now Egypt. And he talks about the complexities of and the challenges that he faced in even being able to access some of the documents, because a lot of the documents are sitting in, behind sort of, locks in museums in the UK and in the US. And he ended up not being able to access some key documents that would have helped him fill out the full picture. It's a beautiful book to read in many respects, but that's one of the examples that struck me. More personally, I've had to deal with, having to get access to museums in the UK or the US for specimens collected in India on species that we want to study in India. So again, who gets access to those? Do you have the right kind of passport to be able to travel to these places, to be able to do the kinds of research that you want to do? Is everybody equally free to pursue their scientific curiosity? We have to decolonize expertise as well, and our notions of what expert knowledge means. In the context of citizen science, we are beginning to recognize that people living in places have valuable ecological knowledge about where they live. But you also should recognize that historical injustice means that our scientific disciplines show the demographic skew. And even finding, if you want to, as an editor or a reviewer, you want to look for peer reviews, finding the right kind of expertise with the right credentials can be challenging because of these historic imbalances. But that doesn't mean there isn't expert knowledge available without those credentials. Right? Again, we have to listen and pay attention to the knowledge of indigenous people, local residents, historically marginalized people. In our teaching, we can decolonize the curricula and syllabi. And in this context of the pandemic, I want to emphasize that we have to make care and community central components of our scientific research. And I'll finish up with this couple of examples of this idea of decolonizing expertise. Here's the paper that just came out in Madhusudan Ecology and Evolution last month, or in December, which found in comparing 10 years of conventional scientific monitoring for conservation in the Amazon with local knowledge, and they found that local knowledge of populations is actually more accurate than the scientific assessments. Go figure. One attempt that students here at NC State are doing, including my former student Deja Perkins and several others who are studying birds, is to take out youth groups, especially focusing on minority groups, and building capacity for more citizen science kind of work by getting people to learn how to identify birds. So there are many things that we can do, and I'm going to stop with this, and hopefully there's some time for questions.
Thank you so much. This was really great, and like a lot for everyone to like think and reflect about, and I think that's central for these kind of conversations. So we have a question from Dr. Todd Arnold. He asks, to what extent does access to previously published research hidden behind paywalls or English language or availability of funding to publish current research fall under the category of decolonized data access?
I think a lot of it, all of that, I would say falls under that category, right? Because it's access to established or published knowledge, it's access to avenues of publication for sharing knowledge, and all of that is important for being able to do, research. And if you're in places where you don't have those access, then that's a massive barrier. Yeah, and as Sudhir texted, message put in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask me directly.
Yeah, I'll just monitor.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Madhu.
Hi.
I'll bite. I just wanted to add a comment to that. As I saw an interesting comment that open access can be kind of a good and bad issue in that, where it obviously provides free access, but authors have to pay for that. And so in terms of how it contributes to decolonizing expertise and decolonizing knowledge and providing access is really an interesting issue in that context.
Yeah, I think the open access movement has some issues to grapple with there that they haven't quite done as much, I think, in thinking through the perspectives of people in poorer countries or low resource communities that don't have the means to pay for open access publishing and the cost of publication. And I'm learning, I'm just become the editor-in-chief for the Bulletin, which is not a peer-reviewed journal of the ESA, but I just literally came from an editorial leadership team meeting across all the ESA journals before this, before coming for this seminar. And one of the big topics of conversation is models of funding and how to make it easier for people, and especially if you want to increase international representation and diversity and inclusion in people who submit to these journals and are able to publish in these journals. How do we deal with the cost of publication under the current models with, Wiley is the publisher for ESA right now. So, commercial publishers involved in the publishing industry. So it's a complex issue, but it certainly is at the heart of this issue of access. And if you want to think about decolonizing that, then there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
If no one's going, I have a small question.
Yeah.
I was wondering how like what your views are on to sort of move away from this dichotomous global North and global South as a terminology, and would that in any way be more transformative in the longer run to sort of like.
Yeah, I agree, and I still use it because it's kind of a common terminology still. But as my partner, my spouse, who's also an ecologist, used to say when we lived in and worked in Central Valley of California, that you have some really, extreme poverty and conditions that are similar or worse than some places in the so-called former third world or global South nations within the US. So these dichotomous thinking is sort of, I think of it as also a product of the European Enlightenment, and we like to classify things and along dichotomous ways, and it can be useful. It's been powerful for many kinds of insights, but it can also get in the way of really understanding the complexities that are involved in that result in these kinds of patterns that we see. So the barriers are not simply in terms of global North, global South, but there's all kinds of complex interactions, because you find hierarchies within the global North and the so-called global North and global South countries as well, in terms of who has access.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask one more question. I wanted to give students an opportunity to ask questions, but Madhu, you you had that slide where you showed the kind of theory about putting a map backwards or upside down. And you're someone who's pushed buttons a lot. And this theme definitely gets people riled up, whether they're pro or feeling like maybe sometimes it gets overemphasized in their minds or I've gotten the feedback from people that we're just talking about diversity and inclusion and not about science anymore, or something like that. So what advice would you have for students and for people who are trying to fight this good fight and getting this pushback, or getting the criticisms, like very open criticisms on Twitter that are just...
Yeah, it can be a tough fight, and it can be demoralizing, especially if you're from the so-called underrepresented communities trying to fight this battle for institutional change. But hopefully some of the examples I give in my talk, and there are more, that make people realize that it's not just about diversity and inclusion as these bureaucratic things or things that distract from science, but that not taking those elements into account actively harms our science, that we have an incomplete understanding of the world, of the ecosystems we are studying, if we don't recognize these factors. Obviously, it's pretty stark in urban areas where you have to pay attention, but even in other places, it's quite clear, like that article about local knowledge versus scientific monitoring of mammals in Amazonia, right? Is it woke politics or being politically correct to hand over or involve local communities in wildlife management there? or is it actually good science because they have better knowledge of the places? This review looking at 10 years of data shows that they actually know the populations better than scientific monitoring does. So why would we not want to improve our science by opening it up, opening the process of how we conduct it? And if you're really curious about the questions, I think you have to be open to other perspectives as well, and not think about, oh, these are distractions. I don't think they're distractions. I think they actively prevent us from seeing things that are important phenomena for the science that we are trying to conduct. Another example in conservation, there's been several review articles that have looked at biodiversity outcomes in places in North America, in South America, in Africa, where indigenous communities have more autonomy in conservation management in so-called protected areas. So there was a review paper a few years ago that showed that the biodiversity outcomes in places that were managed by indigenous communities did much better for conservation and biodiversity outcomes than places that were under more formal sort of official government agency controls, or even under international NGO control. So again, there are benefits to be had in science and in conservation by implementing some of these practices and opening up the processes to different expertise, to people who have been excluded from these processes, because we think science has to be done only in a certain way.
I think we are past our time, and I wish we could continue this. But thank you so much, Dr. Katti, and everyone for stopping by. I hope that was informative for everyone, and we'll continue to have these conversations within our own circles. And
feel free to email me or find me on Twitter, reach out to me. I'm always happy to engage in these conversations.
Thank you so much.
And push buttons if you want.
Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.